In 1994, a small company in California did something that almost nobody in the software industry believed was possible. It took Microsoft to a federal courtroom, accusing the largest software company on earth of stealing its technology, and to everyone's shock, it won. A jury awarded it $120 million in damages. The industry treated it as a landmark, but the joy was short-lived. 4 months later, that same small company signed a settlement and handed Microsoft a license to the very technology it had just proven Microsoft had stolen. It had won the biggest patent verdict against Microsoft in the history of technology at that point, and the victory was worth almost nothing in the end. One analyst summed the whole affair up in a single sentence that became legendary within the industry: Gates wins even when he loses. This is the story of Stac Electronics. Our story begins in the late 1980s with hard drives. Back then, storage was small and it was brutally expensive. A typical drive on a business machine had a capacity of only a few megabytes, more than 10 if you're lucky, and upgrading meant buying a new drive at a price that made people wince. Disk space was by far the constant grinding constraint of personal computing. Every user at some point faced the same miserable ritual of going through their files and deciding what to delete in order to install something new. Stac Electronics sold a product that solved that problem in a way that felt very close to magic. It was called Stacker, and what it did was compress the data on your hard drive on the fly as you used it. You installed it, and almost magically, your drive suddenly held roughly twice as much as it previously could hold. This technology was genuinely groundbreaking and very difficult to replicate. Compression itself was well understood by then, but compressing a file and then decompressing it when you needed it was an entirely different problem from compressing an entire live hard drive that an operating system was constantly reading from and writing to hundreds of times per second. Every single file operation had to be intercepted, compressed or decompressed on the fly, and then handed back fast enough that nobody noticed that compression had taken place. Get it slightly wrong and the machine crawls. Get it badly wrong and you destroy every file the customer owns. Stac had solved that problem well enough that ordinary people trusted it with their entire drives, which is a considerable engineering achievement and, more important for what followed, a patentable one. For a business with a room full of machines or a home user who had spent a fortune on a computer they could no longer fit anything onto, this was an extraordinarily compelling thing to buy. Stacker sold, and it sold very well, reaching around $37 million in annual revenue, which made it a genuine success and attracted the eyes of a particular company. Disk compression was too good an idea for Microsoft to ignore. Microsoft was the company that owned the most popular operating system in the world and had every reason to want the capability built directly into DOS rather than sold separately by somebody else. And so Microsoft did what large companies do when they want technology that already exists. It opened licensing discussions with Stac. Microsoft's people met with Stac's engineers. Microsoft was even allowed to examine Stac's code to understand how it worked and how it could be implemented natively on DOS. Then, all of a sudden, the discussions went quiet. No deal was decided on. Shortly thereafter, Microsoft announced that MS-DOS 6.0 would ship with a built-in disk compression feature called double space, which of course was not a coincidence. In the later lawsuit communications between Stac and Microsoft, it would be revealed that Stac had raised concerns that double space infringed on its patents, but Microsoft insisted that their code was different enough from Stacker that Stac's patent didn't cover it. Around the same time, Microsoft provided Stac with a beta version of MS-DOS 6.0, and Stac's engineers took it apart. Their conclusion was that whatever had or had not been changed from Stac's own source code that Microsoft had seen, double space infringed 2 of Stac's patents. So in January 1993, Stac sued Microsoft. Before we go into the lawsuit itself, I want you to understand how uneven of a fight this actually was. Stac had $37 million in annual revenue, a neat sum for a company in the early 90s, but incredibly modest when put against Microsoft's $4 billion. Microsoft was a company roughly 100 times larger than Stac, with effectively unlimited resources and a well-earned reputation for grinding opponents down through sheer endurance rather than competition. The conventional wisdom in the industry was that suing Microsoft was a way to go bankrupt slowly while being proven right, and plenty of companies had chosen to simply absorb the damage rather than fight it out. Microsoft was by far the most feared software company in the industry. Very few dared to go against them, and of those that did, virtually none of them lived to tell the tale of what happened during the battles. Stac, however, had a legitimate case. Their strategy was to argue legal infringement based on the patents that it had, rather than trying to appeal to emotional fairness on vague notions of business ethics or corporate goodwill. That distinction matters enormously. A claim that a company is a bully is a matter of opinion. A claim that a big company infringed on a specific patent is a technical question with a technical answer, and more importantly, a jury can be walked through it and make up their minds on their own. Stac was not asking a courtroom to decide whether Microsoft was a bully. It was asking them to decide whether its technology had been stolen. Microsoft counterclaimed, alleging that Stac had misappropriated a Microsoft trade secret relating to a preloading feature in MS-DOS, alleging that this had happened when Microsoft provided Stac with a beta version of MS-DOS. Microsoft was seeking an injunction to stop Stac from selling its own product because of this infringement. Now, this is standard practice in litigation of this kind. A counter lawsuit or a counterclaim serves a purpose beyond winning, because a counterclaim fundamentally raises the cost and the risk of fighting. Because now with the counterclaim, Stac was no longer pursuing damages on its own legal action. It was now also defending its right to keep selling the product that kept its lights on, which put them in a difficult spot. On one front, they had to fight Microsoft with dwindling resources. On the other front, their main source of those resources was being challenged by Microsoft in court. Meanwhile, while all this was happening, MS-DOS 6.0, the one that Stac alleged infringed on its patents, shipped in March of 1993 and sold nearly 30 million copies, every one of them containing doublespace, handing users for free the exact capability Stac existed to sell. The commercial effect on Stac was immediate and severe. Its revenue collapsed. It laid off around 20% of its workforce. Its own shareholders sued it. The company was being destroyed in real time while the case was painfully, slowly working its way toward a trial, which is precisely the dynamic that Microsoft wanted to play out. Because Microsoft could absorb legal years of proceedings, but Stac, as a small company, could not survive a prolonged war. This was not a quick and immediate war. This was a war of attrition, a race to see who would cave first, and obviously it was not going to be Microsoft. But Stac held on long enough through its financial turmoil, and on the 23rd of February 1994, they would be rewarded for holding on. A federal jury in Los Angeles returned a verdict. The jury found that Microsoft had infringed Stac's data compression patents and awarded Stac $120 million in compensatory damages. The jury also rejected Microsoft's patent counterclaim, and the court subsequently ordered Microsoft to remove doublespace from MS-DOS, which meant the largest software company in the world had to physically pull a feature out of the operating system running on most of the world's computers. Across the industry, people who had been quietly hoping somebody would land a punch on Microsoft treated it as a genuine historic moment in technology history. But I want you to take a step back for a minute and look closely at the verdict, because while everyone was cheering, the truth is the battle was only beginning, because two details in that verdict matter enormously, and both of them favored Microsoft. The first is that the jury found the infringement was not willful. This is a specific legal finding with real consequences, because willful infringement can multiply damages substantially. The jury concluded that Microsoft had infringed but declined to find that it had done so deliberately or in bad faith, which capped the amount that Stac could claim in damages. The second detail, the one pertaining to the counterclaim, was also also important. The jury found that Stac had misappropriated a Microsoft trade secret concerning a preloading feature and awarded Microsoft $13.6 million. So, while the jury had rejected that Stac had infringed on Microsoft's counterclaim based on patents, it had still found that Stac had misappropriated Microsoft's technology. So the headline was $120 million to Stac, but the net was closer to 106, and more importantly, Microsoft now held a judgment of its own that it fully intended to collect. And let's not forget, Microsoft had endless resources, so they were not just going to take the first verdict as it came. They announced that they would appeal. This is where the story turns bad for Stac, because remember how I said Stac was barely holding on by the time the verdict came? Well, the appeal would mean they would have to wait even longer. Stac had just won $120 million, but because of the appeal, that money could not be paid to it just yet, which was a massive problem for Stac because appeals take years. For a company like Microsoft, legal fees from appeals and court proceedings were part of the cost of doing business. They could afford to fund those for years without noticing the expense. Meanwhile, for a company like Stac, whose revenue was less than 1% of Microsoft's legal costs were a serious financial problem. Stac had won the verdict but was losing the war. The verdict had not yet brought money to the bank and most certainly did not repair its product sales. So in June of 1994, 4 months after the greatest victory, arguably in the technology industry, Stac caved, choosing to settle with Microsoft out of court, and the terms tell you everything about who actually held the power. Microsoft agreed to pay Stac $1 million a month in royalties for 43 months. In total, $43 million, just over a third of what Microsoft had been ordered to pay by the court. And in addition to that, Microsoft made an investment in Stac. And in exchange, Microsoft received full rights to the general patented technology it had just been found to have infringed. Microsoft went to court, lost, was ordered to strip the feature out, and then 4 months later obtained a license to that technology through a negotiated settlement that amounted to pennies on the dollar from a company that could no longer afford to keep fighting. Microsoft's senior vice president for systems, Paul Maritz, made a point of noting that Microsoft would not be offering Stacker itself. Microsoft simply continued shipping compression in DOS under a new homegrown technology called drive space. The reaction from the industry captured it perfectly. Paul Johnson, a technology analyst, delivered the now legendary line, "It's unbelievable. Gates wins even when he loses." Stac took the settlement money and tried to build a future with it, and to its credit, it made wise moves. Realizing that the compression market was gone, it reorientated itself, moving away from consumer disk compression and toward data backup and storage software for businesses, eventually rebranding entirely and operating under a different name in a different market. The Stacker product itself faded as the underlying problem it solved evaporated, because hard drives got enormous and cheap, and a technology that doubles a 100 megabyte drive stops being interesting the moment drives hold gigabytes. In the long run, Stacker, if it hadn't lost to Microsoft, it would have lost to the exponential growth of hard drive capacity. That's not to say Microsoft should be let off the hook, because Stacker's story is as pure a tragedy as you will ever see in the technology industry. Somehow, Microsoft had lost and yet won at the very same time, adding Stacker to a long list of companies that dared to challenge Microsoft and ended up being cautionary tales about the dangers of going up against Microsoft. Thank you for watching.